Okay, well, welcome everybody. I am glad to present Melissa Seymour Fahmy from University of Georgia, and she's presenting the logic of obligatory ends. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for being here, and thank everyone who contributed to organizing and planning this meeting. I really happy to have a reason to come to Mexico City. All right. So, as I'm sure everyone in the room knows, in the Doctrine of Virtue, Kant introduces the concept of an end that is also a duty. And it can hardly be said anymore that obligatory ends are a neglected subject. But in this paper, I want to argue that the concept has some yet unrecognized potential. Kant tells us that ends that are also duties prescribe maxims of actions rather than actions themselves. And a very common view in the literature is that these maxims of action are promotional in nature, which is to say that these maxims direct us to promote the end, and this is how we come to have imperfect duties like beneficence. So the position I defend in the paper is that this account is incomplete. Working from the logic of ends, I defend the view that each obligatory end prescribes multiple maxims of action. The familiar promotional maxims, but also negative, non-diminishing maxims, epistemic maxims, and dispositional maxims. Actually, I don't say anything about dispositional maxims in this truncated version of the paper that I prepared for you today. So we have time for Q&A. Those are the least interesting anyway. You won't miss it. So I take myself to be offering an account of obligatory ends that's fully consistent with what Kant writes in the Doctrine of Virtue, but also develops the concept in a way that Kant did not, at least not explicitly. So what does it mean to have an end? Here's Kant's account, and this is on the handout. An end is an object of free choice, the representation of which determines it to an action by which the object is brought about. Every action, therefore, has its end, and since no one can have an end without, himself making the object of his choice into an end, to have any end of action whatsoever is an act of freedom on the part of the acting subject. So ends are fundamentally connected with willing. To have an end is to be committed to bringing the end about, and this is seen more clearly when ends are contrasted with mere wishes. While a wish is also an object of desire, the representation of it does not determine one to action. In explicating our duties of love to others, Kant contrasts benevolence in wishes, which, he writes, is strictly speaking, only taking delight in the well-being of every other and does not require me to contribute to it. He contrasts benevolence in wishes with what he calls active practical benevolence, making the well-being and happiness of others my end. Similarly, when describing the importance of moral cognition of oneself, Kant warns against taking mere wishes as proof of a good heart, for wishes, however ardent, always remain empty of deeds. I like to contrast ends and wishes. Sometimes I think I have 4 wishes and I have 4 ends and 4,000 wishes. Like it is hard to have an end. So wishes are empty of deeds, whereas ends determine one to action. Because ends are so connected to action, adopting an end places rational constraints on our willing. When we make something our end, we commit ourselves to constructing and pursuing a plan to achieve the end. If we fail to do this, we're either behaving irrationally, though not necessarily immorally, or we've confused an end with a mere wish. The rational constraint imposed by ends is captured in what's become known as the hypothetical imperative. Whoever wills the end also wills, insofar as reason has decisive influence on his actions, the indispensably necessary means that are within his power. So the hypothetical imperative describes one way we might behave irrationally vis-a-vis our own ends. Namely, if we adopt an end, but then refuse to execute the indispensably necessary means to that end that are within our power. But there are other ways we might behave irrationally regarding our own ends. So consider what I might call the negative inverse of the hypothetical imperative. Whoever wills the end must refrain from willing that which would make the end impossible to achieve. If it's my end to attend an event in Los Angeles on 6 p.m. on the 14th of June, it would be irrational to make plans to attend an event in Hong Kong at the same time on the same day. Adopting an end rationally constrains the sorts of ends I may adopt in the future. I behave irrationally if I adopt some end that would make it impossible to achieve another end I currently hold. Ends also create reason for action in less extreme ways, especially when the actions available to us or the means available to us are neither indispensably necessary nor fundamentally incompatible with our end. Very simply, if something is your end, then you have reason to perform those actions that are within your power and conducive to achieving the end. Ends change what counts as a reason for action. Insofar as attending a popular concert is not one of my ends, I do not have reason to stay awake until 12 a.m. in order to attempt to purchase tickets online when they go on sale. I think I should have made this example explicitly about Taylor Swift. Because I really struggled that morning to figure out, is this my end? Do I want to make this my end? Yeah. Okay. But if attending the concert is your end, if going to see Taylor Swift is your end, then you definitely had reason last year to get online at 10 a.m. that morning and try to secure tickets. Though not necessarily decisive reason if there were other means available to you to attend the concert. Maybe you know Taylor personally, and she'll just put some aside for you. So insofar as an action is not necessary for an end, reason to perform the action will not be rationally decisive. So one point I want to highlight is that having an end gives you reason to refrain from doing things that will hinder or undermine your success at achieving the end. And these reasons are as rationally compelling as are reasons to perform actions that are a means to your end. So for example, if my end is to achieve a personal best time in an upcoming race, I have reason to train, but also reason to avoid overtraining, which may cause injury and make my participation in the race impossible. Likewise, my end gives me reason to consume certain kinds of food and drink before the race, like water, but also reason to avoid consuming others, like alcohol. So when it comes to the rational pursuit of ends, what we refrain from doing can be as important as what we do. And what's true for ends in general is equally true for obligatory ends. So I want to turn attention now to obligatory ends, which Kant describes as an end of pure reason, which it represents as an end that is also objectively necessary, an end that, as far as human beings are concerned, it is a duty to have. So there's at least two significant differences between discretionary ends and obligatory ends. First, while we may abandon a discretionary end simply because we no longer care about it, or because its pursuit is too onerous or incompatible with an end we value more, we're not at liberty to abandon obligatory ends. And second, obligatory ends are not ends that can be achieved once and for all, like visiting the pyramids in Egypt. Rather, obligatory ends are ends that we will have for the entirety of our lives. Now, Martin kind of pressed me on this morning, and he says, you know what, some discretionary ends you might have for your entire damn life. And I'm like, that's probably true. So I'll edit that later. Okay. But discretionary ends, even ones you'll have for your whole life, like, I don't know, be a good friend, you could get rid of those at any time. Just drop it. Assuming that one's not a moral end. Maybe it is. Okay. As I noted at the beginning of the paper, obligatory ends and their corresponding duties of virtue are distinguished from other types of duties by their distinctive form of law-giving. Whereas juridical duties give laws for action, ethics gives laws only for maxims of actions. The type of maxim of action most widely acknowledged in the secondary literature is a direct, positive, promotional maxim. And the reason for this is very straightforward. These are the sort of maxims that we find articulated in the doctrine of virtue. When Kant presents maxims of actions that the obligatory ends prescribe, what he describes are direct, positive, promotional maxims. So in the doctrine of virtue, we're informed that one's own perfection prescribes the maxim, cultivate your powers of mind and body so that they're fit to realize any ends you might encounter. as well as the maxim, strive with all one's might that the thought of duty for its own sake is the sufficient incentive of every action conforming to duty. And the other regarding obligatory end prescribes the maxim of promoting others' happiness, though not at the expense or sacrifice of one's own. So these maxims of action are frequently taken to be exhaustive of the moral obligation that flows from obligatory ends. I maintain that if we think through what it means to have an end and apply this understanding to obligatory ends, we arrive at the conclusion that obligatory ends prescribe more than the promotional maxims of action that Kant explicitly articulates. So I've argued that adopting an end gives one reason to perform actions that are a means to the end, as well as equally rationally compelling reasons to refrain from doing things that impede or undermine the end. Following this logic, I maintain that obligatory ends prescribe negative, non-diminishing maxims of action, in addition to the familiar promotional maxims. For the remainder of the paper, I'm going to focus exclusively on the end, others' happiness. I suspect that what I have to say about others' happiness is also true for the self-regarding end, though there may be important differences and I just haven't thought about it enough. Okay, so negative, non-diminishing maxims. I'm arguing that obligatory ends prescribe both positive and negative maxims of action, whereas the positive maxims command us to promote the happiness of others. The negative maxim commands us to refrain from doing things that will diminish others' happiness. If others' happiness is our end, then we have moral reason to avoid doing things that will cause unhappiness, even when doing such things would not be morally impermissible. So the set of actions I want to consider are those that diminish others' happiness, but are not prohibited by a perfect duty. So I'm arguing that the obligatory end gives us moral reason, though not necessarily decisive reason, to refrain from performing these actions. Okay, and so for the purpose of defending the view that obligatory actions prescribe non-diminishing maxims, I will focus on two broad categories of behaviors that typically diminish happiness or well-being. So the first category I'm calling inconsiderate behavior. And by inconsiderate behavior, I mean actions that thoughtlessly cause hurt or inconvenience to others. So Julia Driver describes these types of actions in her 1992 paper, The Subrogatory. The sort of situation Driver's interested in are cases where one does something blameworthy without doing anything wrong or morally impermissible. And one of her examples is mowing one's lawn on a Sunday morning. So I like this example. I think making a lot of noise seems like a good example to begin with. It's both simple and familiar. We've all likely been on both sides, the offender and the offended, at some point in our lives. Others' noise makes it difficult to sleep, to read, to think, to have a conversation, which in turn will cause frustration and irritation. I suspect it's rarely the case that noisemakers are maliciously motivated. Rarely, but not, sometimes sure. They err by pursuing their own ends with too little thought given to how their actions impact others. Another way we might thoughtlessly diminish the happiness of others is through emotional contagion. As Kant himself observed, as a species, we are innately vulnerable to catching other people's emotions. Other forms of inconsiderate behavior include arriving late to an appointment or a performance and failing to acknowledge and appreciate others' contributions to a collective endeavor. So insofar as the happiness of others is our end, I'm arguing that we have moral reason to be mindful of how our behavior, even our mood, impacts others, as well as moral reason to refrain from doing things that will foreseeably diminish others' happiness. The second category of actions that diminish others' happiness is one that I call clueless behavior. Actions that cause hurt to another in virtue of genuine ignorance. So I'm making a distinction between thoughtless and clueless behavior. Thoughtless behavior, as I'm using the phrase, occurs when one is given too little thought to how one's behavior will impact others. Thoughtlessness can be remedied by simply redirecting one's attention to others. We all understand the negative relationship between noise and sleep, or noise and concentration. There's no failure to understand the impact of our action and thoughtless behavior. There's merely a failure to think about the impact of our action on others. Clueless behavior, on the other hand, results from a genuine ignorance or a perspective that we lack and cannot easily take up. And so for this reason, it's more difficult to remedy. I understand a subset of the behaviors collectively known as microaggressions to fall into the category of clueless behavior. Psychologist Kevin Nadal has defined microaggressions as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults towards members of oppressed groups. While some microaggressions are intentionally hostile or derogatory, the ones I want to focus on, the ones that fall into the category of clueless behaviors, are not. In some cases, the perpetrator might regard her comment as a compliment when in fact she has insulted. You're lucky that you're Black. You don't have to work as hard to get into college. Likewise, if you all have, I have a collection of microaggressions. If you have a favorite and would like to share it with me later, I'd welcome it. Likewise, someone might perceive himself to be acting beneficently, helpfully, when he is in fact engaging in the phenomenon colloquially known as mansplaining, delivering unsolicited advice or explanation to a recipient that is equally or more knowledgeable in the subject area. Another might perceive herself to be demonstrating respect when addressing a stranger as sir or ma'am. I think you have in here, it would be senor, senora, but has in fact offended by wrongly gendering the recipient of the address. Clueless microaggressions reveal implicit biases, attitudes, stereotypes, and assumptions the perpetrator is not consciously aware of. For this reason, microaggressions can be difficult to recognize and commonly elicit defensiveness when they're brought to our attention. From a posture of defensiveness, we might be inclined to regard the offended as excessively sensitive or demanding too much in the name of wokeness or political correctness. I had political correctness, but that dates me, doesn't it? It's wokeness now. All right, so the absence of hostile intentions coupled with our genuine ignorance give these behaviors something of a blameless appearance. However, if we care about others' happiness, if this is one of our ends, then we have reason to take microaggressions seriously. Activist and author Adiomo Aluo reports that microaggressions are more than just annoyances. The cumulative effect of these constant reminders that you are less than does real psychological damage. Regular exposure to microaggressions causes a person of color to feel isolated and invalidated. The inability to predict where and when a microaggression may occur leads to hypervigilance, which can then lead to anxiety disorders and depression. At this point, you might be wondering whether the microaggressions I've described as clueless behavior are better characterized as failures of respect rather than behaviors that are morally problematic in virtue of their impact on others' happiness. I certainly don't want to say that microaggressions are not disrespectful. They clearly are, though I think they're a category of disrespectful behavior much subtler than the vices that Kant describes in the Doctrine of Virtue. But I see no reason to think that behavior can't be morally problematic for more than one reason. This is to say, I see no reason to think that the two types of moral deficiencies, failures of respect and too little concern for others' happiness, should be mutually exclusive. On the contrary, there's reason to expect the two failures will be commonly joined. Persons who have proper self-regard will be pained when they receive less respect than they deserve. Disrespect will diminish their well-being, especially if the experience is frequent. More importantly, I think that there is instrumental value in focusing on the relationship between microaggressions and well-being. One of the ways that we come to understand a behavior as disrespectful, perhaps the best way, is to recognize and understand its hurtful impact. Recognizing the hurt may be more immediately accessible to us than understanding what was offensive about a behavior. So shifting the focus from our intention to our impact may help us better understand our own behavior. One might worry that this proposal, focusing on the consequences of our action rather than our motives, does not sound very Kantian. I maintain that a concern with consequences is precisely what we should expect from a normative theory that includes ends that are also duties. To regard an end as one's own entails that we care about whether our actions promote or diminish the end. Obligatory ends are not substantially different from discretionary ends in this regard. All right, so I've argued that adopting others' happiness as our end gives us reason to avoid clueless behaviors that diminish others' happiness, like microaggressions. Avoiding such behaviors will require resolving the underlying ignorance, and this in turn will require agents to go outside their own perspective, to think about the impact of their actions and not just their intentions. In light of this, I think it's reasonable to conclude that obligatory ends must also prescribe indirect epistemic maxims of actions. And these maxims of actions direct us to investigate our own biases and prejudices, to be curious about how our words and actions are likely to be received by others, and to make use of the resources available to us to better understand the perspectives and lived experiences of those who belong to historically marginalized groups. This epistemic duty is indirect insofar as it is a duty to do things that will allow us to fill our direct promotional and non-diminishing duties. All right. This is the most interesting part now. So I'm gonna, Martin Sticker actually kind of brought this question to my attention about non-diminishing maxims and latitude. And so I'm just gonna warn you now, it's a really good question. I don't have a really good answer, so just like lower expectations. I'm just gonna say a little bit about it, but this is the work in progress part. So there's general agreement that we are not required to maximally promote the happiness of others. The promotional duty of beneficence is wide and so admits latitude with respect to how, when, and to what degree we act for the sake of promoting others' happiness. We may sometimes privilege our own happiness, as our happiness is no less important than the happiness of any other. Acknowledging non-diminishing maxims of action raises an interesting question regarding the latitude permitted by wide duties. Do I have a comparable degree of latitude when it comes to diminishing the happiness of others? This question is distinct from the problems of thoughtlessness or clueless behavior that I address above. Here, the question arises when I'm aware that some behavior that serves an end of mine will foreseeably diminish the happiness or well-being of another or multiple others. If I have good reason to believe that some behavior of mine will diminish the happiness of others, do I have the same kind of moral license to engage in this behavior as I have to forego opportunities to promote others' happiness? And so I think this is kind of an interesting question. I mean, there's a sort of literature on asymmetry between harming and benefiting, and do we need different kinds of reason to justify harming rather than failing to benefit? But there are so many kinds of harm. There's so many kinds of harm, and some harms are just very minimal. So I'm just going to say a little bit about this good question. So we might be tempted to say that insofar as we're not rationally compelled to maximally promote any end, it can be rational to sometimes perform an action that's contrary to an end, so long as the action does not render achieving the end impossible or unachievable. For example, it would not be irrational to have a child while one is currently pursuing the end of earning a law degree. While the birth of a child will likely make achieving the end more difficult, it will not make it impossible, and we should expect these kind of trade-offs as long as we have multiple ends. On the basis of this observation, one might conclude that on occasion, agents may permissibly act in ways that foreseeably diminish others' happiness. And while I think this approach has some plausibility, I'm not confident that it's the best way to answer the question about non-diminishing maxims and the question of latitude. So the obligatory end, others' happiness, is not a discrete end that we can achieve or complete like climbing Mount Everest. So So I'm not sure the best comparison is to think about how we make trade-offs between discrete ends that are achievable. Obligatory ends are more like our own happiness. These ends are an ever-present source of reason for action, though they will not always give us decisive reason. Authors like Barbara Herman have pointed out that the picture is kind of more complicated than this. My own happiness gives me reason not merely to perform certain kinds of action, but to craft a certain kind of plan for my life and reflect on it. I must craft this plan in such a way that it renders it compatible with the obligatory ends I am not at liberty to abandon, nor can they ever be achieved. It would be irrational to construct a conception of my own happiness that included fundamentally immoral behavior, like a life of crime, at least insofar as my own moral perfection is an end that I regard as my own. Likewise, I think we should seek to construct conceptions of happiness that can be pursued at minimal expense to the happiness and well-being of others. This observation does not give us a very satisfying answer to the question of how to balance the good I seek for myself with the cost I impose on others. I think it's a difficult question because it seems equally true that we should be prepared sometimes to subordinate our happiness and well-being for the sake of not diminishing the well-being of others, but also that proper self-regard requires that we not always privilege the well-being of others over our own. So in conclusion, I've argued that we underestimate obligatory ends if we assume they prescribe only promotional maxims of action. The logic of ends leads us to acknowledge that obligatory ends also prescribe negative, non-diminishing maxims of action. They provide us with reasons to avoid doing things that will foreseeably diminish others' happiness, even when such behavior is not impermissible. Acknowledging these direct maxims of action leads us to acknowledge indirect epistemic maxims of action, which in turn lead us to acknowledge the importance of cultivating intellectual virtues, in addition to the more familiar virtues of love. Acknowledging these additional maxims of action also raise a new question. So I've discussed the question of latitude. We might also wonder about the relationship between acting on a negative, non-diminishing maxim and gratitude. So according to Kant, when we act beneficently, or even merely benevolently, we put others under an obligation of gratitude. Do we similarly place other agents under obligations of gratitude when we refrain from doing things that diminish their happiness and well-being? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. It's kind of different. They may often not know unless we directly call it to their attention. I refrain from doing this for your sake. So while I apologize, I don't have satisfactory answers to these questions. I hope I have shown that they're worthy of our attention. Thank you.
We have maybe minutes for questions. We have already a question over there. Yes.
Thank you so much, Melissa. My question actually has to do with a particular example I have in mind that shows a kind of conflict between number one, inconsiderate behavior, and number two, where one person's, okay, so I'm just gonna tell you the example. I'm just really curious how you would think about this, given what you've laid out. I tried to find the exact piece that I was thinking of. It's a personal essay by a Yale student who he wrote like an op-ed arguing, like, you know, expressing really the way he felt, in which he felt socially excluded by the way in which the culture at the white culture at Yale treated his music, his playing of music. So I think it's really interesting because there's a conflict here between a group of people's interests in quiet, which it is a learning institution, you know. So you said in your talk, look, their noise distracts people. I'm not sure if that's universally true. That noise distracts people, and so there's an. Okay. You can see where I'm going with this, and so you know, so the student feels that he was experiencing constant microaggressions about his way of playing music. The other students would have felt he was inconsiderate. Like, how would you, and so might you analyze that situation? Again, obviously you haven't read it.
I mean,
I'm just describing it in like.
This is like the challenge of shared space. And sometimes like expectations are everything. And so it sounds like, I mean, they have different expectations about appropriate noise in that shared space. And I think yeah, I mean, I think that's where like compromise, like you don't always want to be quiet for everyone. You're like, you don't want, others' interests to sort of silence you or keep you quiet at all times. So I think that's a situation that kind of calls for compromise there. But it is, I do also get that in that situation, it sounds like it's one against many, the interest of one against, what others desire. But I think in some cases, we can't share space. Some people should not live in close proximity to others because we cannot like reconcile our ends, so sort of incompatibility.
Okay, I'm actually not gonna follow up.
Okay.
I really look forward to talking more. Thank you so much again.
Send me the paper.
I will. Okay, I gotta find it.
We have another question back there, and then Professor. Yes, please. Yeah, just you first.
We'll just go right back. It's not that I disagree, but I'm just thinking about what if somebody was more attracted to keeping it at just a promotional type of maxim rather than a negative non-diminishing maxim. Here might be one worry that they might express to you. The worry of excessive moral fastidiousness. So I'm going to use my college students. But they are not all of them. They're so they're deeply concerned about doing the right thing, and they're hypersensitive to all of this stuff about kind of like microaggressions and all of that. They've read up on all the latest, and so they are so concerned about causing harm unwittingly, even small harms, to the point where it is almost diminishing their own sense of agency. And so if you are someone who's attuned to like negative non-diminishing maxims, it feels like you run pretty quickly into this possibility of like excessive moral fastidiousness, where maybe you don't do that with promotion, although I feel like you can kind of like there might be a similar thing happening with promotion too. But I just wonder how you might respond to that kind of worry.
Yeah, I think that is probably a legitimate sort of worry that one might be so afraid of offending or hurting that that diminishes their agency, and probably, is not conducive to good relationships either. If you can't be sort of relaxed enough. So I would, I'm gonna solve that problem with a new maxim. Throw another one in there. I don't know. So it seems like, I hate the phrase "do no harm." Like, we will do harm. Like, that is inevitable. Harm will happen. And so I think morally, what's important to think about is like the repair that comes after the harm. And so I think if one has certain kinds of tools with regard to repair, how do I repair after I have offended or hurt, unintentionally, then I think that can assuage the sort of fear of doing that. I might make a mistake here, but there are tools available to me to repair the relationship. And I think there's a lot of good that comes in relationships from doing that kind of repair work.
I'm trying to understand the contrast you're trying to do between the promoting happiness of others and the abstaining from diminishing happiness of others. Because abstaining it's kind of ambiguous between an active and a passive understanding and sustaining. So maybe
Yeah.
some of the contrast comes from that, not
Yeah.
from actually one being sustaining and one productive and just.
Mhm.
So you
Yeah, I kind of agree. It's not a sharp line. And I was thinking about my own like training example. You know, so it's like there, you know, you could describe it as I'm abstaining from this or I'm doing that, or you could just describe it as like, here's my protocol that I'm following. I don't, so I think you're right. But I think also, so while I don't think it's not a sharp line between the two, that it can be blurry, and there might be some instances where they might be equally well described as, one or the other. But I definitely think there are some cases where if I did this, it would have a negative impact.
But again, I think part of my point is that in the avoiding part, it seems that paradigmatic examples are not doing things, but not doing things.
Yeah.
Right. So there's it seems that the paradigmatic cases of speaking are passive in a way that promoting is not. Even though there are some cases in which, in order to avoid making other people more happy, you actually have to do something. And I think those are going to be more similar to the other ones because both involve action.
Yeah, or it might be cases where like I've started doing something and then like I pull back. Yeah, all right, change course.
So yeah, I know sort of question.
Great, we have the last question over there. Please go ahead, Professor.
Right, so I was wondering, this was not a real question in the sense that I think something is wrong. I'm just wondering about this. And it's about thoughtlessness. So part of my puzzle is, could it be useful for the analysis to sort of spell out some interpretation of the difference in Kant between an instance of frailty and impurity and depravity? Because you know, the comments, the ism comments, right? Is there a pattern of it? Is it an instance of it? Or is it a way of going about life so that you feel good about yourself while you're harming others? So I wonder if that could be useful in this context to bring out some of the complexity of thoughtlessness. And the other one I had with that, I don't know if you think it's useful, but just because it came into my head.
So like different kinds of thoughtlessness, or like whether it's like a one-time or
right. And so Aaron, you know, firstly, when she tries to say what the modality is in Life of the Mind, she says it's thoughtlessness.
Yeah.
So that evil is thoughtless. But Kant also has ones when he says about how affect is thoughtless. So I'm just wondering if that whole complexity around thoughtlessness could be useful here, also around these examples.
Yeah, I think so. I hadn't thought about the frailty, impurity, depravity distinction with regard to thoughtlessness. Actually, I hadn't even thought about sort of different varieties of thoughtlessness, shallow versus deep. Thank you.
We just ran out of time, so we can go to the next. Thank you, Professor. So,
That was great. Thank you. And like which is always
you need to use this thing, right? For what
I'm saying it's supposed to be already uploaded to PowerPoint.
Ah, okay, great. I don't know.
But you're supposed to
be.
Do you know?
Is there? Perhaps
I'd send the PowerPoint.
Tal vez está aquí, ¿no? El PowerPoint de ella. Ah, okay. Did you send it?
Yeah.
Someone?
Yeah, this morning.
You have a memory stick or something, or you send it to Efraín or?
Yeah, I did. I
Okay.
sent it. Should I send it again? Which email is that?
Pero yo también lo voy
I can send it again.
Perhaps.
To which email?
You
To
can, yes,
Efrain?
perhaps, no, you can send it to my email.
Okay,
because I
tell me
don't-
what it is.
So IQUEPONS and then gmail.com. Thanks.
Okay. Sending. Do you want me to do it now? No, I need I don't have, I only have a USB-C, sorry. I mean, I could present without the slides.
So here is your.
Great, thank you. I think if you download it and then open it. Oh, I see. Okay.
Yes, that is exactly what I'm trying to see. It's a kind of slow.
You have them? Okay. Maybe just try to download it directly.
So we ended up
Minutes as well.
I see, just open it. Oh, I see.
Yes. Enviar sin más, exacto, enviar a.
Great. There was a time people used to do this without slides. I wonder if we can challenge our ability to listen for 25 minutes without the visual. Okay, is it? No, it's fine. I'm
45, you see, and then to go right.
Okay, and if I do this,
We did it.
yes, okay, great.
Okay, and then, well, you can just tell me,
Is it possible to have it show up
yes.
there? Oh, I
That's
see.
his favorite.
I see, okay, all right,
That was.
I'll jump right in.
Okay, ready.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone thank you for having me. Thank you for coming for this talk. Thank you, Melissa, for you'll see how prepping this talk and saving me, I hope, some time and explaining some things. And a special thanks to the organizers for making such a nice, hopefully starting a nice conversation. I'm sorry, I've been charging it all day and it hasn't not charged. Something with the American.
Okay, yes.
Just in case.
Okay, I think this must be a clock.
It's right
Here,
here,
right,
it's
yes.
Okay. I try not to read anymore, but I'm with a 9-hour difference jet lag, and so I think it might be safer to try and read with animation. Okay, so according to the common widespread understanding of Kant's moral theory, to act well in the first place is to act without regard for whether one's action will make one happy. It is therefore usually not a little surprising, especially to students, say, of Kant's philosophy, to learn that he pronounces as early as in the Critique of Pure Reason, and then throughout the critical writings, that the highest good, and so the ultimate object of one's practical reason, consists not simply in virtue, acting morally well from a stable disposition, but also in happiness, albeit, as we know, in exact proportion to a person's moral standing. Kant does not merely claim that any given person's ultimate wish or desire include, as a matter of fact, happiness. Rather, Kant claims that the highest good, so specified, is an a priori necessary object of a will, and that it is inseparably bound with the moral law. The promotion of happiness proportionate to virtue is for human beings the highest necessary end of their actions qua moral agents. So in light of the above, it is a happy development that Kant's account of the highest good has enjoyed a renewed flurry of scholarly interest in recent years, marked the publication recently of 2 essay collections dedicated to the topic. And these cutting-edge contributions, including these collections and elsewhere, engage a series of important questions. All of them I'm going to be leaving completely to one side in order to stay within our time limitations. What I want to focus on is the following. Interpretation of the highest good often take for granted the content, the formal coherence, and the desirability of happiness. I'll begin by disputing this presupposition. Oh, I see, it's not, okay.
Is the previous one? Okay.
Oh my gosh, so much happening. All right, so this is my talk.
Okay.
I think it's
This one.
No, your talk is right there, and this is for some.
Interpretations of the highest good often take for granted. Oh, sorry. No. I'll begin by disputing this supposition. Then I'll argue that Kant's own characterization of happiness is the sum of an agent's inclination, however modified by virtuous adherence to the moral law or by some idea of instrumental prudential reason, are not adequate to his own basic ambition for the idea of the highest good. And to address this problem, I propose a Kantian solution, one that preserved the central Kantian commitments in the form of a novel understanding of happiness. My alternative account of Kantian happiness is based on Kant's own idea of happiness as the satisfaction with one's condition and his account of the possibility of finding pure practical satisfaction in the realization of what he calls objectively, which means rationally or morally determined objects or ends. I'll conclude by showing how subjectively determined objects, those pursued with reference to our inclinations, form an integral part of such practical happiness while playing a distinctly secondary role. I'm just going to continue. The idea that happiness, you can do that. Okay. The idea that happiness is intrinsically desirable seems to stand on. This is okay. We'll just listen to me. It's all good. The idea that happiness is intrinsically desirable seems to stand on solid exegetical footing. Reference on a slide. But it also seems philosophically sound. Disregarding one's material well-being seems like an unattractive conception of the final ends of even the most virtuous agent. But I'll go on to argue such claims must be considered against the background of Kant's actual characterization of happiness. and in particular, under the threat of its incoherence. Kant's basic idea of happiness is introduced already in the Critique of Pure Reason. It is the single end which signifies, quote, the unification of all ends that are given to us by our inclinations, end quote. And this characterization of a unity of inclinations ends as what we aim for, as we aim for happiness, remains more or less constant throughout the critical writing. So we see it in the groundwork, we see it in the second critique, and the third one. However, throughout these works, happiness is consistently presented as fundamentally fraught. Quote, one can form no determinate and sure concept of the sum of the satisfaction of all inclinations under the name of happiness, end quote, Kant writes in the groundwork. And the inability to form a determinate concept of one's happiness means not only that one cannot determine what would make one happy a priori, that seems obvious, but that an agent could not so much as articulate to herself a concrete concept of her own happiness at any particular point in the course of her practical life. It is, Kant goes on to claim, quote, such an indeterminate concept that although every human being wishes to attain this, he can still never say determinedly and consistently with himself what he really wishes and wills. And the basic difficulty here is fundamental. While all the elements that belong to the concept of happiness are empirical and so must be drawn from experience, the idea of happiness, Kant says, requires, quote, an absolute whole, a maximum of well-being in my present condition and in every future condition, end quote. An individual's conception of happiness is not merely therefore likely to contain certain practical contradictions, it is rather internally at odds. Kant elaborates this in several arguments. I'm going to do that quite briefly. First, he claims securing happiness would require omniscience in order to predict both the consequence of all of my actions, but moreover, I have to be able to know the evolution of my own desires, something I actually cannot know a priori. I discover what I want just in my acquaintance with the objects that I discover give me pleasure. Yeah, not bad. I can't do everything. Second, he claims, no, this is perfect. This is good. Maybe another one. I don't know. Let's try another one. Second, he claims an agent's desires are not only unknowable in advance, but are likely contradictory. And so even an omniscient agent would not be able to devise a plan for their satisfaction. Because one, oh, I'm back.
Okay, there, here.
Please, can you have to, only one of us can do it though.
Yes, okay, great.
Here we go. Because one cannot form a determinate concept of happiness, Kant concludes that one cannot, quote, cannot therefore act on determinate principles. This is very important. He says, you cannot act on determinate principles for the sake of being happy, end quote. In other words, one cannot, strictly speaking, act for the sake of happiness at all. This is going to sound controversial, and I'm going to try and show why that is the case. Actually, no, it's too short. I'm just telling you. So he said, because there's nothing to aim at, I can't devise a principle that would try and promote this end. The end is contradictory and incoherent. There's nothing I could do to rationally try and bring that about. Noting these problems, Kant's readers have pointed to the possibility of bringing order and systematicity. That's right. Order and systematicity to the tangle of ever-evolving, ever-multiplying, and always potentially contradictory inclinations by means of what else but reason. Two possible strategies suggest themselves here. First, bringing order into our pursuit of happiness by means of prudential reasons or by means of pure practical reason, that is the moral law. I think neither is sufficient to the task. In order to try and organize one's pursuit of happiness, one can, we know, Kant says in the groundwork, quote, act on empirical counsels. For example, of a regimen, frugality, courtesy, reserve, and so forth, which experienced teachers are most conducive to well-being on the average. So it sounds like, well, there's something we can do. Kant tells us there's these counsels of prudence. But such empirical counsels are only, notice, on the average, reliable. They do not capture any necessary connection between a course of action and an agent's happiness. They merely specify empirically more or less reliable ways to secure satisfaction for most people in most circumstances. Again, it's things like being courteous. They're not only defeasible in the extreme, being courteous can lead you astray, but in principle, they do not directly aim at realizing any of our inclinations. So they're not even, whatever it is that I'm thinking of in happiness, I'm not trying to promote with empirical counsel. I'm just setting things up to improve my chances of doing so. If all I can do to ensure my happiness is to be frugal, courteous, and reserved, the pursuit of happiness
is informing my conduct in only an indirect and limited, we say shallow way. It's a mere auxiliary to the pursuit of my actual ends. Now, another strategy that's been suggested less frequently, but has been, and it's that maybe it's possible to pursue happiness insofar as happiness could be not merely prudentially ordered. So we're not just sort of bring order to inclinations by means of prudential reason, but given true rational form, the form of universal law. Indeed, practical reason can give, we know, the objective validity of a law to a subjective maxim. So giving a maxim, aiming at the realization of particular inclinations, and we know that we can, in principle, give that objective validity to that pursuit. But such a procedure, imagine going through our particular maxims and trying to give them the validity of objective law, cannot be simply applied to the subjective maxim to promote one's happiness. Imagine an agent committed to this procedure in relation to all of her actions. She would not thereby overcome the challenge inherent in the pursuit of happiness. Because what is required for the resolution of a practical conflict between two subjective ends is not just the awareness of their conflict, but a rational way of settling it. Suppose that both contingent ends that I happen to have are taken individually permissible. In such a case, neither the contingent ends themselves nor practical reason can provide a standard according to which we can choose one over the other or order them in some other way. The decisions the morally good agent would have to make between such different ends would ultimately remain arbitrary. And for all these reasons, happiness understood as a sum of inclinations, I argue, is not in itself an ideal that can rationally structure one's action, even insofar as it's constrained by prudential or moral reason. Being happy, in other words, is not an end at which any particular action of mine or any combination of my actions could coherently aim. This is why Kant can justly say that the resistance of inclinations to unification gives rise to another wish beside the wish for happiness, which he thinks we all share, and that is the wish to be rid of them. This is a quote from the second critique. This raises the burning question: what role can happiness ever play in a life guided by practical reason? What could constitute human happiness as part of a life led in recognition of the authority of the moral law? So now we move to my alternative understanding of happiness, happiness reconsidered. So first, just to emphasize, I want us to acknowledge that on behalf of Kant, we face a choice. If we were not to saddle ourselves with the notion of an ideal moral agent as one who's simply unconcerned with their material well-being, giving too much to the detractors of Kant, we can either maintain the standard conception of happiness as the possible sum satisfaction of contingent inclinations, and thus attribute to even the best moral agent an indeterminate end grounded in, quote, an unstable concept, or else we can seek an alternative account. And I propose that we can locate the seeds of an alternative account in Kant's own text. In particular, I want to draw attention in the second way in which Kant sometimes characterizes happiness, and that's as the satisfaction with one's condition. So in addition to sum of inclination, we hear this other account of satisfaction with one's condition. In the second critique, Kant defines happiness as, quote, a rational being's consciousness of the agreeableness of life uninterrupted, accompanying his whole existence. But later, Kant similarly speaks of a condition of happiness as the, quote, satisfaction with one's whole existence, and, quote, and when an agent, quote, needs in order to be satisfied with his condition, end quote. And what I want to do is I wanted to propose to deny the exhaustive identity between the idea of happiness as the satisfaction of inclinations, let's call it HI, and the idea of happiness as the conscious satisfaction with one's existence, HS. This suggestion receives support from Kant's detailing of the kinds of satisfaction, same concept, that a person may find in the beautiful, the agreeable, and the good, i.e. the morally good, in the Critique of the Power of Judgment, published only 2 years after publication of the Critique of Practical Reason. Here, Kant clarifies that the pursuit of both agreeable and good object involves an interest in their object, and both afford satisfaction, though of a different sort. So Kant says to will something and to have satisfaction in its existence, to take an interest in it, are identical. This relates, by the way, to, I think, what Melissa was bringing out when she's saying to think a concern in whether or not my end is brought about is not something that's foreign to Kantian concern. When I'm acting and trying to realize an end, I am in fact concerned with its realization. And Kant says, when it's realized, I obtain satisfaction. And Kant says that when we obtain satisfaction, the realization of a good end, i.e. an end that I have set for myself from recognition of the moral law, I have, quote, pure practical satisfaction. And so combining the idea of pure practical satisfaction, the attainment of good objects, with the idea of happiness as a satisfaction with one's condition, we can see why it would be appropriate to suppose that the virtuous agent's happiness might in the first place be based not in the satisfaction of inclination, but of her objectively determined ends. In the virtuous agent HS, happiness consists first and foremost in the fulfillment of the particular ends of duty, which are determined directly as a consequence of one's moral commitments, and only secondarily in the fulfillment of those ends which are determined with reference to one's material needs and subjective inclinations. In this way, while we cannot secure the possibility of the attainment of all ends, we can secure the possibility of satisfaction with one's condition, and thus rescuing an idea of happiness that is not essentially incoherent. And I'd add that while the accomplishment of objectively determined ends cannot form a part of an agent's virtue, so the accomplishment, right, we can say an agent is virtuous whether or not the ends that they've aimed at through recognition of the moral law, they were able to actually realize them. This depends only on the state of her will. Whether or not an agent attained her objectively determined ends certainly can and indeed ought to form a part of the condition of the satisfaction of an agent with her own life, i.e. it ought to form a part of the highest good. Once I set myself a concrete practical end, if I have done so from conscious of the moral law, my action is morally worthy. But whether I'm also content or satisfied with my existence depends not only on the ends I have set for myself, but also on whether I was able to realize them. Now, in conclusion, I'm going to raise a question. So even we found this satisfaction, no. I have one template. This is all the papers I ever give are in one document with different titles. So this is the lesson. Okay. But if you'd like, I can talk to you about why we should care about the survival of humanity. Okay. What about the ends of our inclinations? Okay. So I've said a moral agent is going to be concerned first and foremost with the satisfaction that they're going to achieve from the realization. Well, they're not going to be concerned with satisfaction. They're going to aim at the realization of their morally objective ends. When they realize they're going to have satisfaction, and what the inclusion of happiness in the highest good means is to mark the fact we're not indifferent to whether or not these moral ends that we aim at actually come about. But what of the ends of our inclination? Must we disregard them completely? And I don't think so. This is where I'm going to conclude, because I think this reading gives us a new way of integrating morally neutral ends in a way that doesn't return us to the paradoxes of happiness. And this I'm going to have to present briefly, but I'm obviously happy to talk more about it in Q&A and after the talk. To say that the matter of the will can be supplied by virtue of the will's own activity, which is really what I'm saying. I'm saying consciousness of the moral law can give us consciousness of the particular end they need to be pursuing in concrete situations, is not to deny that practical life requires paying attention to our material needs and inclination. And to show that, I want to say two things. First of all, I think it's really important not to underestimate the extent to which it is possible, according to Kant, to pursue what looks like apparently ordinary material ends, in fact, from duty. And in the third critique, Kant, I think, it tries to show that there are the kind of ends that you can pursue, an agent can pursue simply from inclination, and then through rational work, realize that, in fact, they're necessary for the pursuit of moral ends. So in his example, he gives the example of health, and he says it's immediately agreeable to anyone who possesses it, but it's nevertheless possible to find it good. It can, in such a case, quote, be referred by reason to ends as a state, namely, that makes us fit for all our tasks. The satisfaction we enjoy from obtaining good object, that's a place where Kant says it, that's the pure practical satisfaction. So that's first of all, a lot of our ends, and I think if people want to give me counterexamples, a lot of our ends, I think it's important to see Kant himself can realize we can actually pursue them from duty. But second, as for the pursuit of merely permissible ends, I would like to complicate the standard picture of how that pursuit forms a part of moral life. In order to ascertain the role of ordinary, morally indifferent ends in the life of the virtuous agent, I think we must turn to Kant's account of moral character, his account of Gesinnung, and his idea that the good moral character involves a holistic subordination of the pursuit of instrumental material principles to the pursuit of moral principles. And to understand this idea of the subordination as the idea, and I want us to hear this idea of the subordination as the idea that even the pursuit of those ends are not implied by one's duty at all, can be performed not in what I call a vacuum of mere moral permissibility. So to use maybe Helga's term, something that, it's not about creating little pockets where we can just do whatever we want, but rather for a good moral agent, that pursuit of these morally neutral ends can be done in full moral consciousness of the moral indifference or neutrality of particular choices. So from consciousness of the moral law, the good moral agent orders her practical life in such a way that accords proper place both to those ends that derive from moral law directly, primary place, and those ends that we should think of as a matter of indifference from the standpoint of morality. Which is to say, I don't think an agent, or the standard picture we think of a good moral agent isn't one that begins with a desire, say for a certain kind of food, evaluate it for permissibility, and then pursue it if it has passed the test. I think this is an impoverished view of the relationship between our moral commitments and their sensory nature. And I think Kant's later works, especially the Third Critique in Religion, gave us the resources to recognize a far more satisfying alternative. According to this alternative, a good practical agent's commitment to any practical duty involves essentially an immanent awareness of the distinction between ends that are morally determined and those objects of choice that ought to be guided by inclination or taste. So I know in my pursuit of my moral life that at this point, it's inclination that has to be guiding me. Thus, the agent dutifully committed to a diverse diet, for instance, is aware of the fact that it's permissible for her to let inclination guide her with regard to, say, her salad dressing or the order of her dishes. She's equally aware of the fact that it cannot be left to the guidance of inclination whether or not she will go to the dentist. Part of what it is to be committed to my duty means that even in the case where an agent lets inclination be her guide, it is from within her moral commitment that she determines when and to what extent it is appropriate to defer to inclination in determining a particular aspect of a particular decision. So now let's return to happiness. Once we see the potential for this material subjective ends to be in this way holistically interwoven in the pursuit of objectively determined ends, namely those we pursue from recognition of the moral law, i.e. that become a part of the very fabric of moral life, we can see why the satisfaction that one can have in such material subjective ends is fundamentally secondary to the pure practical satisfaction. The pursuit of these ends, the secondary ends, is always circumscribed by practical rationality. And in conclusion, I think this interpretation happily resolved the central difficulty I've identified above, namely the internal incoherence of the concept of happiness, because the sort of hierarchical organization of ends demanded by the moral Gesinnung inherently imposes a genuine unity on an agent's ends. Second, we can give a meaningful interpretation, and this is something sort of in the offing. I think there are many advantages and many avenues this opens in our understanding of the highest good. I can't go into any of them right now, but I think with this idea of happiness, a lot of the questions that are being raised in the literature on the highest good, we can have a new approach. We can raise them in a new way. I'll just mention one kind of somewhat minor, but to me very vexing one, which is that we can finally give a meaningful interpretation of proportionality in the highest good without having to awkwardly reconceive one's virtue and one's happiness to somehow be quantifiable. Like, what does it mean? I'm 80% good, so I get 80% of my desires. On this picture, an agent deserves the realization of those ends that are set from duty or properly subordinate to the latter. That's what it means, that I only want the happiness that I can have proportionate to my virtue. I only want, from the standpoint of my rational will, the satisfaction that I'll be getting by the realization of my morally set ends. Thus, I conclude that far from simply establishing the moral agent's concern with the realization of her own or everyone's contingent desires and inclinations, the highest good articulates a holistic unity of morally determined and subjectively determined ends, an agent's own as well as that of others. Thank you.
Time for some questions.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I have at least I'm scared that.
Good.
There's just well, not you, but there's like the risk of just exploiting an equivocation in the notion of satisfaction So that satisfaction in the first sense of happiness is a very different notion than satisfaction in the second definition of happiness. So even though satisfaction seems to play a common role in both definitions of happiness, that's just a result of we use the same word for different concepts. Yeah.
I mean, I'd want to hear more to make sure that I'm going to touch upon it. But I mean, I think the question for me, or the way I would want to first hear that question, is whether or not the idea of happiness as satisfaction of one's condition is preferable or even like somehow equal to the idea of the satisfaction of all my inclinations, or as many of them as I can, or maximum. And for me, I mean, this project really stems from many, many years of being confused and really perplexed by the idea of just kind of helping ourselves, the ease with which I saw everyone around me sort of think that a moral agent, in addition to all the things she cares about because of a moral duty, just also like in a side project is I just want to satisfy all my inclinations, no matter what they are. And some of them are or silly or like waste. And that somehow this is what I kind of mean, the vacuum of moral permissibility. And it goes to like my greater interest in overcoming all sorts of appearances of dualism in practical philosophy. But it's to say that for me, the idea that primarily, insofar as the practical moral agent is concerned with her happiness, which I think we want to preserve, we can begin by thinking, okay, she wants to be satisfied with her condition. For me, is a good starting point, which is to say, we're going to find out which of the various ends or proto-ends that she has by virtue of being a moral agent, by virtue of being a sensible finite agent, she's going to need in order to be satisfied with her condition. But the very idea, but let's not sort of beg the question of happiness by assuming I just want all my inclinations satisfied, but begin by saying, okay, there's a general sort of pretension to realization of some of my ends, to satisfaction with my condition. Let's like begin to explore that. For me, that's philosophically really persuasive because it answers this real philosophical problem that I've had, that I've tried to articulate before. So I don't think this is just exploiting an equivocation in the term. But
no, I don't know if we have time.
Yes, we do. So go ahead, yes.
Okay, so I'm sorry
started
I
late.
mentioned this because it seems that the question is formulated in the problem you're trying to solve. The way you have just described it is clearly formulated in the first notion of happiness and in that sense of satisfaction. But I feel that maybe I'm wrong about that. And so I feel that when you turn to the second one, you have actually abandoned the first problem. Because you are actually saying we are not going to recover that kind of happiness.
no, so I mean, maybe it's a matter of being more clear or more persuasive, but I took myself, the latter part of the talk was perhaps telegraphically trying to then answer exactly that concern. Wait, what happened to all my inclinations? I may have inclinations. I may have things that I'm disposed to, I'm desirous of, not where that explanation does not involve, at least kind of on a first go, anything to do with my awareness of the moral law. And that's where I say, but it might be that 25 minutes are not quite enough time to show it. But that's why I say, I think the place for us, I'll put it this way, the most promising place to explore from a Kantian perspective, or within Kant's works, the relationship between the pursuit of the objective end, which is to say the ends of reason, and the ends that to do with our sensible nature, is the religion. First of all, that's the place where he makes a distinction between subjectively and objectively determined ends. That's the first place he says explicitly, every action, even a moral action, has to be determined by an end. But in this case, it's not, we're not deriving the action from the end, we're deriving the action from the commitment to our moral law. And then, not much into the discussion in the first book of the religion, he introduced the idea of Gesinnung. And I think that's the place where Kant gives us kind of a very, very insightful clue when he talks about the good moral agent. Their character is constituted by, well, it's very mysterious, an or maxim, the highest maxim, the ultimate maxim, but he talks about the subordination of pursuit of of ends of sensible maxims to the pursuit of moral maxims. I say, okay, what does that mean? That's the place where he says that's the relationship. And so I can say a lot more about it, but how do we understand that subordination? What is that subordination? And I say, well, let's not think of the subordination as just, I'm a morally good agent, and sometimes I want other things, and I check if I can. Oh, thank goodness I can. But I'm trying to think that in the idea of subordination, when he's talking about moral character, we have the possibility of thinking, no, the good moral agent is constantly, self-consciously aware of the fact that there are places where it's okay to be guided by my physical need, by my pleasures, by the things that delight me, by the things that delight others. You know, it's ideas to give dignity to this, to both our capacity to have sensible pleasure and pleasures that are not moral, but not in a way where, again, kind of, we're not putting them as a sort of playpen, but we're saying, no, it's something where I'm constantly, you know, it's one consciousness, one moral consciousness that accords that place of guidance by the consideration that is not moral. Is that helpful?
No, very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for pushing too.
Back there, we have another question. Please go ahead. Yes, sure.
I'm Andrew. We're doing names upstairs. I don't know.
Oh, please, yes, I support that.
Hi, thanks for the paper. I think you're right that Kant does think that we really care about the fulfillment of our well-intentioned ends, and that can be a source of great happiness. And I do think that in a way that's something like what we hope for. But I wonder about whether we also need to invoke the other kind of happiness in order to keep the highest good going, just because there will be worlds in which, you know, we're all in the situation of the righteous Spinoza where we're slogging it out, but somehow it's not, you know, the virtuous are still suffering and the wicked seem to prosper and all it's kind of demoralized. And it looks like if we can see that the efforts that we're making morally are not going to come to fruition, there has to be some kind of like auxiliary source of happiness that we can reel in that's just connected to our inclination. Otherwise, we're going to give up on the highest good altogether.
Yeah. So I mean, this kind of touches on many things which you know, everybody's. But I think again, what I try in this project is to articulate. Again, this really deep puzzle, not just about happiness now, but now what could the highest good really mean, given that Kant insists that the highest good is something that you can, you know, derive from the moral law. It's something that it's the final end of the goodwill. And so the question is, if we take seriously the ideas, I can't be doing something if I know it's impossible. That seems persuasive to me. And I want to understand, okay, but what would that moral agent want from the perspective of practical, rational agency? And it's hard for me to think, or it's hard for me to defend or see how to defend the idea that what they want is, first of all, which I think you agree on, so just the satisfaction of all these inclinations, whatever they may be. Now we have another consideration because of her consciousness of herself as a practical moral agent, and because it's completely incoherent and there's nothing to do there. And now there's this question of whether or not you have to have another concept of happiness in the highest good. And what I'd want to hear from you, or like from somebody articulating that objection, is why this idea that I've been beginning to articulate, where I find in the consciousness of the moral agent that she is concerned with her inclinations, but in this other way than we thought before. She's concerned in inclination in a way that's always subordinate to her practical moral project. Like what's the remainder?
Yeah, I think the thought would be something like, well, you know, every time I try to do something good, it somehow doesn't come to fruition. Like I gave all this money to charity and it always turns out to be a corrupt charity and the CEO runs out with the money or whatever.
That's fine, but that's not the other kind of happiness. That's the happiness I want. You're concerned with, like, I want a particular.
So I'm saying if you're in a situation where over and over that happens, then it looks like you would take some solace in the thought that, well, we're in the
but at least I'll feel good.
Other kind of,
Oh, I'll have to think. That seems very misguided to me. I'll have to think about what would be a good way of articulating that. And but something about it again, for me, it's about what could a moral agent like actually find solace in. And the thought is like, oh, well, I suffer and I'm righteous and the righteous suffer too. The other ones, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. But I have this, I'll take solace in this other kind of happiness because from the standpoint of the moral agent, these aren't worthy pursuits, or if they are worthy, it has to be in this way where they have room, holistic room in my good life. That's kind of my direction.
Okay, we have the last question over here.
Right here.
Well,
Okay. Thank you so much. That was really good. I appreciated your connection to the third critique and sort of validation of pleasure and intellectual pleasure. It might also be interesting to go to the appendix right at the end, sections 82, 83, where we think about what reflective judgment might afford a rational being, thinking about its end, where Kant does seem to distinguish there between pursuing happiness there as the sort of the political goal, as opposed to producing the conditions of moral life. And he goes to the latter, saying that we don't know how to reflectively judge what would produce happiness for others.
Yes, I do touch upon that as part, but maybe you mean something else. As part of when I show that Kant's awareness, I don't know if it's worry, but it's almost like it's like sort of obvious to him that happiness is a problem, is consistent. Like it's in the first critique and it's in the third critique and it's in the religion. But maybe you're thinking there's something else there. So
That's it, even with his reclamation of happiness.
Oh,
there at the end,
indeed. So that is that.
Political goal, this remains a personal goal.
Thank you. That is in the longer version of the paper. Indeed, but I think it's really fascinating. You know, it's always exciting when something's taken a little for granted, and then to see, well, he's insisting that this isn't working. And he has very, sorry, I don't know if off the cuff, and I'll blame the judge, but he has very very evocative formulations there of why thinking about happiness. It's some of the best ones. Is like deranged concept. You can never figure out what would be good for the species to promote. But again, we go back to his duty to promote the happiness of others and the highest good. So there must be something we can do. And my question is, what concept of happiness is adequate to playing that role?
okay, great. There was a last question, very short, if possible. Yes.
I really like this talk. I just think you may not have gone far enough from my point of view.
Oh, yeah.
You're leaving the inclinations there. And the way I read the second critique is he revisits the highest good from the first critique, but now he has the resources for a transcendental deduction of the highest good from the principles of pure practical reason. And that means for him that you gain satisfaction in and through what you do as a reasoning being. And so you no longer, at least in principle, depend on how the world goes. It's all internal to the structure of practical reason.
So this, I think it's very important to then notice that in this, I think an advantage of my interpretation, that in the second critique is also where he articulates how unsatisfactory an idea of the highest good is, where it consists in the kind of happiness that you get, where that's just a consciousness of virtue. And he said, like, that can't be you. So this satisfaction I'm talking about is not just a satisfaction with, but I'm good. So no, it says the moral agent cares whether or not these really important things, like things are really important to me qua moral agent. I care about whether or not they work out. And if they don't, I mourn them. I think it's tragic. I am angry because I fail, because this is important. It's so important. It's morally important. So I think we have to find room for the realization of the ends. That would be the first stage. It's not enough that I just know I was good. That gives some sense. I mean, that's not nothing for a moral agent, but it's not everything, even from a purely moral perspective. And then there's the question, for me, I hear what you're saying is the question of how to articulate something I've kind of just said by the by, which is the satisfaction, the realization of the moral ends is primary. The fact that there's room for satisfaction, the realization with the other ends, those are secondary. I do think it's both philosophically and in looking at the religion, I think Kant, I want to defend this idea that within a good moral life, I'm conscious of the fact that there are things that are a matter of moral indifference, and and that's, we can embrace that. So.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry for this war of the technology. No, thank you so much for helping, and thank you. Thanks. Yes, I'm sorry for whatever unwitting part I had in messing it up.
It's okay. I didn't notice you have the control there.
I'm sorry, I'm and then but this time I could not. I'm just flaking what's in the. I think I went it right.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi.
Yeah. Okay.
Sí, por fin, muchas gracias. Es que no me dijo nada de Efraín, nada más así como que ahora le voy a la carga, ¿no? Yo creo que se le fue.
Yeah, exactly.
¿Vas a usar el proyector?
No. So the last one came.
The last one? No, you are the last one. Actually.
Okay, but there were 4, right?
Yes.
So he didn't came.
No, he didn't came, yes.
Okay.
Ay, muchas gracias. Qué bueno que cerrarlo nada más. Gracias. Sí, gracias. Ay, pues sí, pues creo que no lo vamos a necesitar. You have a handout or something?
No, I uploaded a handout in that Google Drive.
Folder, okay.
So
they are supposed to have it in advance.
Well,
hopefully.
it's just a schema and some quotations. So
okay, great. But do you want to project it or?
It's maybe not, because I want it doesn't follow exactly the presentation,
okay,
so
okay,
maybe it can be puzzle.
Yeah, okay, yes. So. So, and do you mind if I get some coffee?
No, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, please. You want some?
No, thank you.
You get all of the stuff that Kant is supposed to not have.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
So that's, yeah, that's why it's beautiful. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
So, shall we start? The last presentation for this session, Professor Marilia Espirito-Santo from the Universidade Federal de Rio de Janeiro. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so first I'd like to thank everyone who helped organize this meeting that has been so productive since the first talk in the morning. I don't have slides, I don't have handouts. Actually, I do have a handout, but I uploaded from that Google Drive folder. So it's just a schema with some quotations, and I'm gonna read the paper. So in the opening, rethinking the goodwill in Kant's Groundwork. In the opening sentence of Groundwork 1, Kant claims that, I quote, "It is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed even beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation, except a goodwill." To explain this aspect of the goodwill, he claims further that the goodwill is good in itself. When Kant announces the development of the concept of goodwill in Groundwork 1, he introduces the concept of duty, which contains that of a goodwill, though under certain subjective limitations and hindrances. The meaning of Kant's conception of a goodwill is controversial. Despite the difference among its most influential interpretations, it seems that it's common to assume the equivalence between both aspects of the goodwill. First, that the goodwill is good without limitation, ohne Einschränkung, and second, that it's good in itself, and sich. In his classical study, The Categorical Imperative, Herbert Patton explicitly defends this thesis. I could not find any objection to this interpretation in recent studies, and I'm inclined to say that Patton's equivalence thesis is apparently generally considered either accurate or inoffensive. In my view, however, this thesis is neither correct nor inoffensive, so it's necessary to amend it. And just to be fair, I think that Schoenecker and Wood, Eric Watkins recently, and Karl Omerix, they don't think that there is an equivalence between internal and then unlimited. So against Patton's interpretation, I argue in this paper that it's necessary to distinguish both aspects of the goodwill, namely its unlimited aspect as good without limitation, and its internal aspect as good in itself. I find textual support to my non-equivalence thesis on a distinction Kant stresses in the Critique of Pure Reason when he comments on the term absolute. Accordingly, the difference between the will of a perfectly rational being and the will of an imperfectly rational being clarifies the necessity to distinguish both aspects of the goodwill. In fact, there is no problem with Patton's equivalence thesis in the case of a perfectly rational being. The problem concerns only the case of an imperfectly rational being. To defend my non-equivalence thesis in this later case alone, I argue that an imperfect will, such as a human will, can be good in itself, but is not good without limitation. My argument has 3 steps. First, I recall Kant's claim that a good will is the only thing that can be unconditionally good, while other things are conditionally good. I also recall Kant's claim that a good will can be taken as good without limitation because it is good in itself. I argue, however, that it's not so in the case of an imperfect will. Thus, considering only a perfectly rational pure will, I claim that the internal aspect of the good will B implies its unlimited aspect. 2. In the second step, I consider the case of human beings whose imperfect will is good under certain subjective limitations. I argue that an imperfect will cannot be taken as good without limitation, though it can be good in itself. Now, considering only an imperfect will, I claim that the internal aspect of the good will does not imply its unlimited aspect. This analysis of finitude leads me to the transition from the concept of goodwill to the concept of duty. Drawing on Kant's distinction between the extension and the intention of a concept, I argue that the concept of duty intentionally contains or includes the concept of goodwill, and that the concept of goodwill extensionally contains or subordinates the concept of duty. In other words, every action from duty is a moral action, but not every moral action is an action from duty. 3. Finally, in the third step, the distinction between both aspects of the goodwill leads me to rethink Karl Omerix's objection to Kant's alleged petitio principii in Groundwork 1. Before that, however, I examined the status of the concept of goodwill regarding the structure of the argument of Groundwork 1 and its title, Transition from Common Rational to Philosophic Moral Cognition. I challenge the claim that Kant's analytical procedure requires exposition of a goodwill as a given concept. I argue that the role of the concept of goodwill should be interpreted as a strategic starting point that works, first, for contrasting a perfect will with an imperfect will, and second, for introducing the concept of duty. Since the concept of duty intentionally contains the concept of goodwill, the concept that Kant analyzes to search for the supreme principle of morality is that of duty, not the concept of goodwill. This reveals that the concept of goodwill plays neither a rhetorical role in Groundwork 1, nor a foundational role in Kant's entire practical philosophy. This also reveals that the so-called teleological argument is not an excursus before the introduction of the concept of duty. Rather, it not only resolves the possible objections from defenders of eudaimonia, but it also justifies the in itself aspect of a good will, presenting reason in its pure practical use as the means whose end is to completely determine the will. So first, in the preface to the Groundwork, Kant states the aim of the text, namely to search for and establish the supreme principle of morality. Accordingly, he states the most suitable method for reaching it. On the search for task, he proceeds analytically from common cognition to the determination of the supreme principle. On the establishment task, he proceeds synthetically from the examination of this principle and its sources back to common cognition in which we find it used. The task of the first paragraph of Groundwork 1 is to define the domain of morality and the conditions of possibility for moral judgments. Kant's starting point is the conception of a good will according to common cognition. Moral goodness must be opposed to the useful and the pleasant, which comprise all non-moral goods. This opposition is supposedly exhaustive and represents an essential difference between them. Moral goodness is unconditionally good, while non-moral goodness is conditionally good. Something is pleasant from an agent only insofar as it is delightful for that agent, and in this sense, it is good for her. Something is useful for an agent only insofar as it is serviceable as a good means for an end set by that agent. Something is morally good, however, if it's good in each case and in general. According to Kant, the only thing that can be considered unconditionally good is the good will, so far characterized as good without limitation. Kant compares the goodness of a good will with that of other candidates for unlimited goods. These other goods are divided into two species. First, gifts of nature, and second, gift of fortune. Kant's evaluation of gifts of nature is distributive. It depends on the analysis of each case in which they appear. Their instances are good if and only if the will is good. The state of the will in a given situation is a necessary and sufficient condition for evaluating instances of gifts of nature. Kant's evaluation of gifts of fortune is in turn collective. Their evaluation does not depend on the analysis of each case in which they appear. The will has to be good as a whole or in general. The goodness of the will, Kant says, not only corrects the influence of this gift of fortune on the mind and the whole principle of action, but also seems to constitute the indispensable condition of worthiness to be happy. If this species of goods exhausts the candidates that common sense would consider as unlimited good, if their goodness depends on the goodness of the will, but not conversely, whether in a given situation or in general, then everyone would agree that they are far from being good without limitation. But why can a good will be so characterized? Why should common sense agree that a good will is the only thing in this world and beyond it that is good without limitation? According to Kant, the answer to that question is because it is good in itself. In other words, the will is good in all respects because of its volition. In Kant terms, and I quote, "A good will is not good because of what it effects or accomplishes, because of its fitness to attain some proposed end, but only because of its volition. That is, it is good in itself and regarded for itself is to be valued incomparably higher than all that could merely be brought about by in favor of some inclination, and indeed, if you will, of the sum of all inclinations." Hence, unlike other goods, the good will is good in itself. It is noteworthy that Kant does not claim that a will simpliciter is the only thing that can be considered good without limitation. He claims that the good will, as good in itself, is the only thing that can be considered good without limitation. According to Peyton's interpretation, since the terms in itself and without limitation are equivalent, there is no difficulty to understand them. To say that a good will is good in itself is to say, according to Peyton, that is absolute or unconditioned good. To say that a good will is good without limitation is to say, according to Peyton, that is unconditioned or absolute good.
If we consider the case of a will completely determined by reason as a perfect will, there is no problem in his interpretation. The problem, however, lies in saying that the terms in itself and without limitation are interchangeable if we consider the case of a will not completely determined by reason, that is, an imperfect will. In my reading, the without limitation aspect on the one hand and the in itself aspect on the other hand are not interchangeable in this later case. Actually, they are not only different concepts, but they also play different roles in Kant's argument in the entire groundwork. My non-equivalence thesis refers to a distinction Kant stresses in the Critique of Pure Reason when he expounds on the term absolute. In fact, there is a confusion between something considered in itself or internally and something considered in every relation or unlimitedly. Sometimes these two meanings of the term absolute agree, and I can infer the unlimited from the internal. In most cases, however, they disagree. Dogmatism takes advantage of this ambiguity in dealing with notions like absolute possibility. According to Kant, and I quote, "The word absolute is now more often used merely to indicate that something is valid of a thing considered in itself and thus internally. In this meaning, absolutely possible would signify what is possible in itself, internally, which is in fact the least one can say of an object. On the contrary, however, it is also sometimes used to indicate that something is valid in every relation, unlimited, for example, absolute dominion. And in this meaning, absolutely possible would signify what is possible in all respects in every relation, which is again the most I can say about the possibility of a thing." End of quotation. Kant intends to eliminate the ambiguity of the term absolute by distinguishing when it's legitimate to infer the unlimited aspect of something from its internal aspect and when it's illegitimate to do so. Now, back to the groundwork, how should we understand the absolute value of the goodwill? We know that a perfectly good will, as a divine or holy will, always wills the good. It is good in itself or by its volition, and in every relation or without limitation. I can infer thus the unlimited from the internal. The same does not happen, however, with an imperfectly good will, such as the human will. Although the human will has a capacity for willing the morally good, it does not always will in this way. It is not good by its volition in every relation. I cannot infer thus the unlimited from the internal. In this sense, it is good under certain limitations. That is why Kant has to introduce the concept of duty. In Kant's words, and I quote, "To develop the concept of a will that is to be esteemed in itself and that is good apart from any further purpose, we shall set before ourselves the concept of duty, which contains that of a good will, though under certain subjective limitations and hindrances." End of quotation. The introduction of the concept of duty leads us to a problem with the double meaning of the concept of the goodwill as good in itself. My question is, how can we conciliate Kant's claim about the without limitation aspect of the will good in itself with Kant's claim about its with limitation aspect if we admit Platon's equivalence thesis? How can we conciliate Kant's claim in the opening sentence of Groundwork 1 with the claim that he makes after he introduces the concept of duty if we refuse my non-equivalence thesis? My answer in the second step of my argument is that we cannot conciliate the without limitation aspect and the with limitation aspect of the goodwill if we admit Platon's equivalence thesis. We have to admit my non-equivalence thesis to conciliate Kant's claim in the opening sentence of Groundwork 1 with the claim that he makes after he introduces the concept of duty. Kant states that the concept of duty contains the concept of goodwill. According to Kant's logical texts, the verb contain has an extensional and an intentional sense. the extensional sense corresponds literally to the expression contained under, which designates a relationship of subordination between concepts. The intentional sense, in turn, corresponds literally to the expression contained in, which designates a relationship of inclusion between concepts. The intention and the extension of a concept stand in inverse relation. The more a concept contains under in itself, the less it contains in itself, and vice versa. Every concept P is called broader than a concept S in a judgment if P subordinates S or if S is contained under P. Besides, every concept S is called narrower than a concept P in a judgment if S includes P or P is contained in S. When Kant writes in Groundwork 1 that the concept of duty contains the concept of goodwill, he does not determine whether the concept of duty is the broader or the narrower concept in this relationship. He does not determine whether the concept of duty contains the concept of goodwill in an extensional or in an intentional sense. Thus, both possibilities remain open. If the concept of goodwill is contained under the concept of duty, then the concept of duty is a broader concept. However, if the concept of goodwill is contained in the concept of duty, then the concept of duty is a narrower concept. In my reading of Groundwork 1, Kant can only mean that the concept of goodwill is contained in the concept of duty, and that the concept of duty is contained under the concept of goodwill. In other words, the concept of duty contains the concept of goodwill in an intentional sense, while the concept of goodwill contains the concept of duty in an extensional sense. Since the concept of duty is a narrower concept in this relationship, Kant is able to claim in Groundwork 2 that the concept of duty applies only to imperfectly good will, such as human will, and not to a perfectly good will, such as a divine or holy will. Thus, every action from duty is an action of a good will, but not every action of a good will is an action from duty. Since the good will is the condition of morality, we can restate this claim to say that every action from duty is a moral action, but not every moral action is an action from duty. The philosophical tradition conceives of the will as the power of opposites. Kant develops this conception by defining the will as the capacity to act according to representations. In this sense, the will is practical reason, which can be pure or not. A perfectly good will, on the one hand, does not act from duty, since it's completely determined by reason. In Kant's words, in the case of a perfectly rational being, the will is a capacity to choose only that which reason, independently of inclination, recognizes as practically necessary, there is as good. So, by its subjective constitution, a perfectly good will can determine only through the representation of good. Hence, the ought is out of place here. End of quotation. In the case of a perfectly rational being, I can always infer the without limitation aspect of the good will from its in itself aspect and vice versa. This means that the internal aspect of the good will implies its unlimited aspect. On the other hand, an imperfectly good will is not completely determined by reason. It is exposed also to subjective conditions. So, by its constitution, an imperfect will can either choose that which reason recognizes as good or not. It can either choose that which satisfies its inclinations or not. These inclinations restrict the goodness of the good will. In this case, I cannot infer the without limitation aspect of the good will from its in itself aspect. This means that the internal aspect of the good will does not imply its unlimited aspect. Thus, by introducing the concept of goodwill under certain limitations, the concept of duty expresses the non-equivalence between the in itself aspect and the without limitation aspect of the goodwill. If we admit Peyton's equivalence thesis, we cannot conciliate Kant's claim in the opening sentence of Groundwork 1 about the without limitation aspect of the goodwill with the claim he makes after he introduces the concept of duty about the with limitation aspect of the goodwill. Only the non-equivalence thesis can conciliate these aspects with each other and both with the in itself aspect of the goodwill. The structure of the argument of Groundwork 1 becomes clearer when we realize that the concept of duty contains the concept of goodwill in an intentional sense. Kant does not expound on the concept of goodwill as a given concept. According to the analytical procedure, the concept that Kant analyzes to search for the supreme principle of morality is that of duty. In view of the transition from the concept of goodwill to that of duty, there is thus a mismatch between the order of subject matters and the order of reasons in Groundwork 1. It is clearer why Kant starts from the will that is good without limitation and goes on to justify that the will is good in itself. Kant does that because the concept of a will that is good under certain limitations is defined in relation to a will that is good in itself. Actually, Kant takes the concept of goodwill as a strategic starting point for presenting the concept of duty, which he clarifies with 3 propositions. Following the analytical procedure, Kant regresses from the concept of duty as a condition to the supreme principle of morality as its condition. The function of the goodwill is thus more than just rhetorical. One can say it plays a heuristic role, as Karl Amerix affirms, if this means a strategy to inform a first version of the formula of universal law from the contrast between a perfect will and an imperfect will. Actually, this first version of FUL must determine the will in order for the will to be called good absolutely and without limitation. Yet, it is fair to say that it plays a foundational role, as Guido de Almeida argues for, if this means the conceptual priority of the perfect in relation to the imperfect. The will that is good without limitation is conceptually prior in relation to the will good under limitations, just as the moral good is conceptually prior in relation to the moral evil, according to Kant's religion. Now, regarding the unlimited goodness of the goodwill, Amerix calls attention to a problem in its justification. Despite the 3 lines of interpretation that correspond to the most likely reference of the expression goodwill, namely the particular orientation view, the general capacity view, and the whole character view, Amerix suggests that might be a petitio principii in the justification of the special status of the unlimited goodwill in contrast to the other candidates for the unlimited good. Yet, if my non-equivalence thesis is correct, this alleged petitio principii in the justification of the unlimited goodness of a goodwill does not occur. In my reading, this is so because the internal goodness of a goodwill justifies its unlimited goodness. If my reading is correct, the next question is, what justifies the internal goodness of a goodwill? The answer is, in a single word, rationality. Reason is what justifies the internal goodness of a goodwill. Kant's argument for this justification is a reduction ad absurdum with a teleological postulate. The so-called teleological argument is not a mere excursus in Groundwork 1, as the literature broadly assumes. Rather, it plays an essential role in Kant's defense of the internal and the unlimited aspects of the goodwill, since Kant puts the idea of a will good in itself to the test. Despite the agreement of common sense with the absolute worth of a goodwill, Kant admits that a suspicion must yet arise that its covered basis is perhaps my mere high-flow fantasy, and that we may have misunderstood the purpose of nature in assigning reason to our will as governor. We can sketch the so-called teleological arguments as follows. So, postulate 1. In the natural constitution of an organized being, there is no instrument for some end other than what is optimally suitable for that end. So Christopher Horn calls this first postulate as principle of suitability. Postulate 2. Human beings are endowed by nature with reason and will. Problem 1. Is nature's purpose for a being with reason and will its happiness or not? Hypothesis 1. If the proper end of nature in a being with reason and will were its happiness, its preservation, then consequence 1. The instinct would be the optimally suitable instrument for that. And consequence 2. Nature would have avoided giving reason a role to play in action, there is, to have a practical use. Argument against hypothesis 1. Both its consequences contradict postulate 1, or the principle of suitability and postulate 2. So, if happiness were the proper end of nature in human beings who are endowed with reason and will, then they would be a whole whose parts disagree with nature's purpose. Otherwise, what would be reason's role in attaining happiness, since instinct is the more appropriate instrument for that? Hypothesis 2. If the proper end of nature in a being with reason and will were not happiness, then, consequence 1, reason is given to us as a practical faculty. There is one that is to influence the will. And consequence 2, the true vocation of reason must be to produce a will that is good in itself. Argument for hypothesis 2. Its consequences verify postulate 1, the principle of suitability, and postulate 2. With this reduction ad absurdum, Kant emphasizes both that reason has a role in determining the will, and that this role cannot be merely instrumental. There is, it cannot consist in choosing the best possible means for among those that could possibly satisfy an object of the will. Reason might have a proper function rather than the Aristotelian function of deliberation. Its proper function as pure practical reason is to produce a will that is good in itself. If my reading is correct, the next question would be, what justifies the complete determination of the will by reason? Since Kant cannot answer this question until Groundwork 3, this is the petitio principii which he has to solve in the deduction of the categorical imperative. Kant shifts from the analytical to the synthetic procedure in Groundwork 3 to present a direct argument for the real possibility of human morality. Actually, the proof that pure practical reason can determine an imperfect will is beyond the analytical procedure of Groundwork 1. In other words, Kant's argument solves the problem of the unlimited goodness of the good will in the case of a perfectly rational being, whose will is completely determined by reason. But this argument is far from compelling in the case of an imperfectly rational being, whose will is not completely determined by reason. Especially noteworthy is that when an imperfect will surpasses or overcomes its limitations and shows itself as morally good, it acts like a perfect will. Yet, it cannot be called without limitation, since the possibility of turning the ethical order upside down, subordinating the moral law to the principle of self-love, remains open to it. Otherwise, how should we understand Kant's conception of corruption in the religion? Rather more significant is that if we accept Platon's equivalence thesis, we have to admit that whoever wills and acts morally well once, wills and acts morally well always, and that whoever wills and acts morally bad once, wills and acts morally bad always. But again, this contradicts Kant's conception of corruption and salvation. So, perhaps the distinction between the unlimited and the internal aspects of a good will also has consequences for understanding some conceptions of Kant's religion, such as salvation, corruption, grace, and moral progress. So that's it. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions.
think perhaps you were very clear and convincing. It really was straight.
Well, thank you.
Okay, yes, please.
I wanted to ask you a sort of minor question, at least to begin with. I was somewhat surprised that you identified goodness of will with morality. I would have thought that morality only applies to beings that experience the good as a duty.
Okay, well, yeah, I think that Alan Woods, maybe perhaps he has the same
I mean, it
interpretation.
doesn't
Yeah.
affect the substance of what you're saying. It just puzzled me since, in general, you were emphasizing the fact that there's this broad category that includes finite and infinite beings, and that what they have in common is crucial, namely that there's an intrinsic agency to reason that allows reason to constitute something that's absolutely good. But in both cases, it's actually different, because the good of the goodwill that's, this divine will is good without limitation, whereas the good of the human or other finite rational will is subject to duty, subject to having other reasons to act than that of the good. So my thought was, well, isn't that just what morality is, as opposed to the good?
Yeah, well, as I understand the groundwork, so we have this broad concept of morality that's valid, it applies for human beings, finite rational beings, and for infinite rational beings. And the difference would be the concept of duty, because for this absolutely rational will, morality is just descriptive for this kind of will, and for us it's normative. That's why we need the concept of duty. But the goodwill would be for every rational will. So that's how I understand the groundwork. So in the beginning, he's presenting what the concept of morality, and the concept of morality, according to common cognition, is this concept of goodwill, and it applies for absolutely rational will and for our finite rational will. But for the finite, we need a duty. And of course, in the second section, this concept, when we make the transition to the metaphysics of morals, this concept of morality will be the concept of an autonomous will, and not more the concept of a good will. And also, we do have, like, for a divine will, it's an autonomous will as well. So, as I understand the groundwork. So I'm not sure if in your reading, because once I was discussing with Alan Wood, for him, morality is just, we talk about morality when there is a conflict. That's why we just talk morality of human beings, and like we don't talk about morality for God, for example. So I'm not sure if in your reading we need this conflict for talking about morality, or.
Well, so my view was, you can talk about morality for angels, because you can be a fallen angel, the devil, right? So there's a question, do I do the right thing or not? You can talk about that for human beings, but for a being that just does the good, there's no, the issue of morality doesn't come up.
Mhm.
I mean, do you want to say in response that it would be, it's still, like, what sort of good is it? It has to be the moral good. And so in that sense, the being going after the good is playing, I mean, is in the domain of morality.
Well, I would say that that's from the human or the point of view of the finite rational being, who's trying to make sense of a being that's ultimately completely incomprehensible in its goodness to them. So it's an anthropomorphic projection.
Any talk of morality.
Yes.
Well, I do have a question. Well, it's a kind of follow-up of these last remarks. How is well, actually something I don't understand in Kant. How do we understand the concept of finitude in this context? I mean, and I just got puzzled because of the example of the angels, because one thing is finitude in the sense of I don't know, mortality, for instance. Another thing is the finitude in the sense of the limits of understanding. And I was thinking about the example of the fallen angel, because the fallen angel has a limitation. He doesn't die, of course, that is clear, but he has a limitation in his understanding. And that is the reason he can fall, because he doesn't understand something. And perhaps the fallen angel is not a case of an infinite will in the sense of your like remarking, because the fallen angel is infinite in his understanding, but infinite with regard his life. So perhaps this is, well, of course, Kant doesn't speak about this in the text, but I think could be like interesting to like ask in what sense we understand finitude and infinity in this context.
Well, finitude would be rationality and sensibility. So we are sensuous beings besides being rational. And infinitude is just being rational. So if you have a completely rational will, this would be infinitude. But for us, human beings, we are finite beings because we are also sensuous. So we can determine our actions not only from reason, but also from experience. That's why we have this, our actions can be determined by pure rationality, that would be from morality, or by not pure rationality, and would be determined by happiness, and this means by experience in a sense. So it would be finitude. Those are the subjective limitations, these inclinations and everything that's related to sensibility. So that's how I understand the finitude.
Okay, so it hasn't anything to do with finitude of life, but with finitude with regard to this dimension of sensibility.
Yeah.
So the angels are also, well, in this case, they have a body.
Yeah.
So they are also like in the situation of being a finite in this regard. So regardless, they never die. They are subject to experience, subject to sensibility, since they have body.
Yeah.
So
the infinitude will be divine will or holy will. So,
totally.
Yeah. But then, and as I understand, well, the morality is descriptive of the will of God, for example.
Totally. Good.
So yeah. So we disagree in this, that I think that morality is also for God. So it's not just for, not just in conflict.
Just to press this, why do you think it's important that to ascribe morality to God as opposed to goodness?
As opposed, I don't know.
No, I mean, ascribing morality is important to you, to God, but I'm perfectly happy to say God is good in a supreme sense. I don't quite see what the point of ascribing morality to God is, since that seems like it's only relevant to the kinds of creatures that actually do make the sorts of choices that we do.
Yeah, well, I think it's important because conceptually, the imperfect is determined after the perfect. So to determine how morality works for an imperfect rational will, we need to know how it works for the perfect rational will. So that's why we have the goodwill, and the goodwill for us appears or is represented as a duty. So, and God has a goodwill, but the duty doesn't apply to him.
Right, but you've added something here. So you have the goodwill, right? And God has that, and we have that in a lesser sense. And then you say, well, human beings experience the goodwill as duty. And then you also want to say, well, we need to ascribe as a common feature to us and God morality. And I don't see what work it's doing in your view. It's not that, I mean, it's really a very minor point, but I just can't quite see why you need it. So why you need the claim.
I think he has a question, yeah.
I just support of what you're saying against that here. So can't we just say that the moral law applies to God, but in a different way, like?
Yes, I think so.
Don't you think God has an understanding of moral?
Well,
or is not? Isn't God motivated
so
by moral law as well?
It doesn't apply in the same way.
Right, but it does apply, right?
Well, God understands the moral law, sure, because it applies to creatures, but God is not subject to the moral law. God is the subject.
It's not constrained by it, but isn't God motivated by the good, the value?
Yeah, but
again, it's the good, not the morality. Morality is something distinct from the good itself, because the good itself is non-contrastive. But morality is, I think, always contrastive. It always involves the possibility of doing something contrary to it.
Okay, but the moral law is a pure rational law, right?
Right.
So it's an autonomous law. So that's why it should have also apply for God, because God is a purely rational being. So when he legislates for himself, is the pure legislation of rationality, and so it's autonomy.
And it's motivated by it without being constrained.
Yeah, exactly. That's the difference, because we are constrained. We represent this legislation as a duty. It's normative for us, and it's not normative for God. But what we have in common, rationality. And what Kant is putting to test is that we, finite beings, we can also legislate as pure rational beings. And in this sense, we'll be exactly like God. The difference would be that we represent this legislation of our pure rationality as a duty. So that's normative for us and not normative for God. But then it would be exactly the same legislation.
Okay.
Yes, would you say that morality applies to God just as rationality applies to God?
Yeah, pure rationality.
Yeah,
so if God is a rational being, so morality applies to him. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I want to dispute.
Yeah.
I mean, on your view, Kant becomes a kind of natural theologian. He believes in this conception of reason that's accessible to the human being, that covers both the human and the divine. And that's not, on my view, Kant's view. Kant thinks that we have reason, and we project our capacities to the extent that we can onto God to make sense of something that's ultimately completely inscrutable to us. I mean, the sense in which God has reason is almost a pun for Kant, because we have to apply our conception of reason to God, and that's not legitimate. And we don't have a grip on the common conception of reason that applies to us and God.
Okay. I think that's it.
Well, we agree to disagree. So.
We agree to disagree. Okay. Thank you very much.